9/11.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Why was the sprinkler system in WTC-7 not activated? Why did this 47-story building collapse?
Since then, Larry Silverstein, after a long period of ignoring it, finally had no choice and had to come out and say, well, what I meant was that we were going to pull the firefighters.
To pull the word "it," the pronoun appears to be the same, referring to the same noun, which would not be a firefighter brigade. And we know that there weren't any firefighters in there anyway.
They were keeping people out. They evacuated the building.
There are photos available, which we've looked at, and those show some damage on the south side. I've looked at the FEMA reports on this and the preliminary NIST report. FEMA says very clearly that the damage, as far as they can see, was not sufficiently extensive to cause collapse. I mean, after all, the damage came from the collapse of the towers. It was 7 hours later that Building 7 collapsed, so obviously the damage was not sufficient to bring the building down, otherwise it would have just come down immediately. This is the FEMA report, says our best hypothesis, which is fire plus damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Quite an admission. Then they say further study is needed here. If it was the south side that somehow NIST and FEMA got it wrong, you know, and somehow these columns were actually severed inside, then with the damage on the south side, you would then expect from the way statics works that the building would topple towards the south. You see, knock out the south side, but it doesn't. It comes really straight down and also very rapidly. So Building 7 is very clearly, when you look at the data, something funny is going on there, and the delay in the NIST report, this really does look like controlled demolition.
Rightly so, I think there should be attention paid to that, but I think more attention should be paid to Silverstein and the fact that he had just purchased the lease on the World Trade Center tower complex.
Silverstein filed a record insurance policy just months before the attacks. The contracts had not even been formally written.
It wasn't a lot of money compared to the payoff that he got through the insurance claims, and they attempted to file it as two separate attacks, because, you know, one on each tower, which would double his investment, you know, if you will, because he made a lot of money off of the collapse of those buildings, Larry Silverstein. And I think that's probably more of a focus than his pull-it comments.
Building 7 contained the offices of the IRS, Secret Service, Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. Concerning the tower's collapse, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, said, quote, "Layers of slabs pancake on top of each other during a collapse." National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, also investigated the World Trade Center collapse.
Let me say about the NIST report, my paper and Kevin Ryan's paper addressed the NIST report, and those two papers are available at journalof911studies.com. NIST commissioned Underwriters Laboratories to do an actual experiment test with fire on floor assemblies. These are model floor assemblies now, built just like the World Trade Center floor assemblies. This is the right thing to do. Do an experiment. Underwriters Laboratories built the floor assemblies, put fire in there, more intense actually than what you would expect in the towers. They beefed up those fires. NIST, to their credit, says, yeah, that's right. The steel does not melt in these towers, but maybe warps enough. So we're looking at the warping here, see. And of course, in these experiments where they had these extra hot fires for a long time, the steel did not melt, you see, at all. But what you do have is warping. So you've got these long floor assemblies, and the warping in the middle was about 3 inches, not that much, okay? 3 inches warping. But they didn't fail, see? They warped, yeah, 3 inches, but no failure. Kevin Ryan, he was working at Underwriters Laboratories at the time.
My name is Kevin Ryan, and currently technical services engineer for a healthcare company. I live in Indiana, and I was previously a division manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a division of Underwriters Laboratories, also in Indiana. I have a degree in chemistry from Indiana University, and I have a certification in quality engineering, which is very closely related to standards in the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I was a laboratory manager at UL for years, so I know about testing samples from national standards. Primarily my involvement, though, is being given information both verbally and in writing about UL's involvement. Also seeing the importance of the issue, and then putting those two things into questions back to my upper management and what we were doing as a company to respond to the official story. But I think to some extent I was fooled by the official story as much as anyone, and I had to admit to myself at one point that I was wrong. That was in 2003. 2 years before that, right after 9/11, is when the chief executive officer of my company, Underwriters Laboratories, had told the staff that UL had tested the steel, had actually certified the steel, he said, used to build the World Trade Center towers. And found out that the steel evidence had been destroyed from the buildings. That related quite directly to the statements made by our chief executive officer that we had tested steel for fire resistance, and yet the steel had been destroyed, which the evidence would have told us what had actually happened. I first sent a formal question to our chief executive officer at Underwriters Laboratories in 2003, in late 2003, and I laid these concerns out to him. I said, well, you told us that we tested the steel or certified the steel. This steel has been destroyed. There's alternative explanations for what happened. You know, the official explanation is something that is, if true, extremely low in probability. So what are we doing? What are you doing to protect our reputation as a company? And he responded a month later. He did confirm that UL had tested the steel used in the World Trade Center buildings with quite a number of statements that I have in writing. Clearly, this chief executive officer, who was a Harvard-trained lawyer, by the way, not an engineer, had fully accepted the official story and had been given information himself about testing done 40 years ago by our company to certify the steel in the World Trade Center buildings. And he shared that both verbally and in writing with staff at UL. When he wrote to me, he copied several top executives who all have this in writing right now. And but he asked me to be patient, wait for the report from NIST, because UL was working closely with them to try and figure out what happened, and eventually there would be an explanation. And I did wait for another year, and the report came out. It included a great deal of contradictory information. They had done physical tests, both at UL and at NIST, that showed that the steel could not have softened, the floors could not have collapsed. And yet the report was coming out suggesting these things actually did happen. So after a period of about a year, I made a presentation in Chicago where I spelled out the problems with this latest story, official story of collapse, because really the NIST report is one of a string of stories that have been given. Kind of a media story was given, Towering Inferno, a FEMA report was given, it was a pancake story, the Silverstein insurance claim was another story. NIST now has had a couple of stories, but this final story is summarized kind of in 7 steps. And if you walk through those and fairly summarize them and look at known facts about the buildings, look at the report within itself to see if it's self-consistent, just look at the story and see if it's realistic. In all three cases, you can see that it's not, that it's actually false at every one of those 7 steps. And that's just a collapse initiation sequence. They don't really describe the actual dynamics